at least in part what this passage from the book of Joshua is, a tale of espionage, complete with an air of danger, a narrow escape, and the gained cooperation of someone on the inside. I'm just guessing, given our location right next to the agency, that some of you know people with thrilling first-hand experiences of such activities. Not that they could tell us about it. I've never been a spy. I know, that's what spies always say. I've never been a spy. I have enough knowledge of the trade from movies and TV shows to know that spying is inherently dangerous work. It's risky. You have to rely on your cover not being blown, and if it is, you have to rely on people protecting you until you can get back to safety. Perhaps as risky as being a spy, or maybe even riskier, is to be discovered harboring or otherwise aiding and abetting spies. That can put you in danger too. This is the situation that Rahab finds herself in today's scripture passage. She's right in the middle of a good spy story, taking a risk to help some outsiders. Rahab, the harlot with a heart of gold, hides the Israelite spies on the roof of her home when the king's men come looking for them. Rahab, the quick thinker, dares to provide shelter to strangers who represent a foreign power. Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute, betrays her own tribe, which makes her at first glance an odd choice to lift up for commendation and reflection this evening. But Rahab has always been treated as a sympathetic, indeed even a heralded figure in Jewish and Christian history. Early rabbinic writing praises Rahab, calling her one of the four most beautiful women in the history of the world. She's hailed in some works as the first Gentile convert to the God of Israel. The writer of Matthew, himself a Jew, lists Rahab as one of only four women in his genealogy of Jesus. Rahab, the prostitute, is celebrated. Rahab is celebrated, of course, because she takes the side of the Israelites in their conquest of Jericho, the first city they take in the Promised Land. Her decision to do so may have been somewhat calculated, I'll grant you. One might reasonably assert, given that she tells the spy she's heard all about the Israelites, that in taking the risk to help them, she's also weighed the danger in not doing so. Rahab is aware of the power of the army that she surmises will likely overtake her city with or without her aid. But the book of Joshua wants to make the claim that her decision is centered in something beyond just a human calculus of self and family preservation. The book of Joshua claims that her decision is based in faith in the power of Israel's God. Before I say any more about Rahab praising the power of God, let me acknowledge that I've always had a problem with the book of Joshua and the whole conquest of Canaan thing. God's commands to the Israelites as they enter the Promised Land seem bloodthirsty and frankly genocidal. Not even the best scholarly spin doctor can explain away God's command to wipe out everyone, men, women, and children, at least not to my satisfaction. I don't know about yours. That hasn't stopped commentators from trying to spin it for a couple of thousand years, however. The conquest was just a situational thing, they tell us, necessary to get the nation underway. It represented a God or an understanding of God which morphed over the course of the Old Testament and into the New into something more mature and loving. More like the God who in Torah called them to welcome the stranger. The God who in the prophet Isaiah speaks of a peaceable kingdom where the lion lays down with the lamb. More like the God, by the time of Jesus, whose name is Joshua, instructs his followers to love their enemies and pray for their persecutors. Good. embrace this change in view of God and still affirm the cognitive dissonance that wiping out a city in God's name 1,500 years earlier causes. Whenever you deal with the problem of bloodshed in the book of Joshua, the story introduces us to Rahab, a woman from whom I think we have something to learn. Knowing that the walls of her city are going to fall because she trusts in the power of Israel's God, Rahab casts her lot with the God of the spies she harbors at no small risk to herself. Arthur C. Brooks, in yesterday's New York Times, wrote an op-ed entitled "How the Modern World Made Cowards of Us All." In it, he shares how the virtue of prudence has come to be tied to faint-heartedness, caution, and a general bias against action. You know, wouldn't be prudent. Brooks mentions that the earliest uses of prudence from the Latin prudentia date from the 14th century, and they have little to do with fearfulness or habitual reluctance. Instead, they had to do with righteous decision-making that rooted in acuity and practical wisdom. Brooks then refers to a recent study in which thousands of people in the throes of a difficult decision, like whether to wed or whether to take a new job or leave a job, for instance, offered to make their choice on the basis of an economist researcher's coin flip. Heads yes, tails no. Now, Brooks comments about the absurdity of that, and then he goes on to note that the study documented that the people who came up with heads were more likely to be happy with their decision. He writes, "Here's what all this means. Our sin tends to be timidity, not rashness. On average, we say no too much when faced with an opportunity or dilemma, which interestingly, I might add, is not really prudent." He closes his piece with these words: "True prudence means eschewing safety and familiarity in favor of entrepreneurial living. It requires clear eyes, a courageous heart, and an adventurous spirit." Back to Rahab then, our harlot with the golden heart, who lived inside a wall constructed between outsiders and insiders, and made the prudent, clear-eyed, but risky decision to harbor a couple of Israelite spies. What was behind her bold action, and what might she and it have to say to us as individuals and as a congregation this evening? What might we learn from Rahab? The first thing to note is that Rahab was not timid. That in itself is a virtue. As it says in Paul's second letter to Timothy, God did not give us a spirit of cowardice or timidity, but of power and love and self-discipline. Being bold, Paul tells Timothy, is a good thing. Second is that Rahab had faith, and it led to action. Rahab is mentioned 3 times in the New Testament. Once in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, once in the book of Hebrews, and once in the letter of James. Hebrews holds her up as a model of faith. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had received the spies in peace. And James commends her for her works. Was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them away by another road? The third thing to learn from Rahab is that her bold faith led to her daring to welcome and protect 2 utter strangers. That's where her faith found expression. That's where her faith was evident in her works, in protecting and being hospitable to these spies, whom she understood to be messengers of God. If you're curious, the name Rahab in Hebrew literally means wide, spacious, roomy, hospitable. It is Rahab's risky but prudent hospitality that I'd like to dwell on now. I believe Rahab made her decision to welcome and protect the spies in faith, but I also think she did so knowing that the walls of her city and her society were coming down anyway. The walls they'd set up to defend themselves against the outsider were bound to fall regardless. She knew that in order to save her hide, herself and her family, she'd have to be found on the right side of welcome. That's what the crimson cord that dangled from her window meant, that she'd opted to welcome the Israelites and their God, to see her connection with them. It was a sign that they were of a piece, that she was connected to them, and as such, she and all those who belonged to her would be protected, just as the blood on the doorpost served to protect the Hebrews at the Passover. Rahab literally lived inside a wall, in that liminal space between insider and outsider. Given her profession, she knew the power of human drives and how all human beings share those drives in common. We all bleed the same color, red or crimson. We all share the same basic needs. She knew the truth of what Maya Angelou wrote long before Maya wrote it. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unlike. Rahab took a risk for the sake of hospitality. Hopefully you've already begun hearing that at our retreat in June, the session adopted living as a Matthew 25 congregation as our theme for the year ahead. Matthew 25 ends the story that Jesus tells his disciples about, ends with the story about how Jesus tells his disciples about the sheep being separated from the goats, and how those who lived and acted on their faith can be distinguished from those who didn't. It will be on the basis, Jesus says, of how they treated the least of these, his brothers and sisters. You know the parable. The king comes to the sheep and says, "Come and inherit the kingdom that was established for you from the beginning of the world, because I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me, vulnerable and you took care of me, sick and in prison and you visited me." And the sheep who inherit the kingdom, the goats who do not, both protest. "When did we see you this way?" King responds, King Jesus responds, "Whenever you help people like this, you helped me." It's a way of living into the call of Matthew 25. The challenge to be a Matthew 25 congregation, the session has decided to take the bold step of committing Emmanuel through the Facets program to serve as a hypothermia shelter for people who need to spend nights out of the cold during the week leading up to Christmas. We will shelter and feed up to 40 people a night for that week from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. They'll be sleeping in here. It will be a week when our preschool will not be in session, so that's convenient. We're going to need a lot of volunteer help to make this happen. We are the only church in McLean who's doing this. I think we can pull it off. I believe we can pull it off because I asked Mary Ann Vaughn, our church business administrator, if there were any obstacles that would prevent it. And believe this or not, she said no. That her church in Maryland does the same kind of thing for week 2. I believe that we can pull this off because I know you. I know that we're ready for a challenge, and I know that it's just 1 week. It occurred to me as I studied the story of Rahab that a red cord runs from her window all the way to Matthew 25. Matthew 25 might just be saying, are sent to us as spies from God. Undercover representatives whom we can choose to help or not. Just as Rahab helping the Israelite spies saved her hide and the lives of her family, you and I reaching out to and protecting those in need saves our souls in a world that frankly is crumbling. The walls are coming down. They are. There's a tree planted in Israel in honor of Corrie ten Boom, Dutch Reformed Christian who hid and protected hundreds of Jews as part of the resistance in Holland. She was Dutch Reformed, that's close kin to Presbyterian. There was a space in her home known as the hiding place. She could fit 6 Jews at a time in there. Jews weren't spies, they were just innocent men, women, and children. Corrie and her family put themselves at risk to hide them. Ten Bones were taken to a concentration camp because they harbored Jews. Unlike some members of her family who perished there, Corrie survived. There's another tree planted in Israel in honor of Johanna Eck, who lived in Berlin during the time of the Nazi persecution. The tree is planted there because Eck, a Christian, harbored 4 different Jewish people in her home over the course of years. Questioned about her motive for doing so, Eck expressed herself as follows. The motives for my help, nothing special in a particular case. In principle, what I think is this. If a fellow human being is in distress and I can help him, then it becomes my duty and my responsibility. Were I to refrain from doing so, then I would betray the task that life or perhaps God demands from me. Human beings, so it seems to me, make up a big unity. They strike themselves and all in the face when they do injustice to each other. These, she said, are my motives. Nancy Harris, one of our members, told me more than once about a friend of hers who had parents, or maybe it was grandparents, who were killed during the Holocaust. Her friend tells Nancy she sizes people up. I'm looking at them and thinking, would this person hide? Would this person hide? I turn the question back on myself. Would I have the prudence, faith, courage to hide someone? Think about that red cord stretching from Rahab's window through Matthew 25 in the 1930s and 40s, all the way to me. And I think and I pray, God, I hope so. Cheer up. I'm not asking you, the session is not asking you, God's not asking you to hide people this December. All we're asking is to help provide shelter for 40 people who might die if they don't have a space